Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 723rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the immense pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Matthew Higgs and Andrew Woolbright. We are thrilled to welcome poet Terrence Arjoon here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place and of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Matthew Higgs is an artist, curator, and writer. He has been director and chief curator of White Columns since 2004. Over the past 30 years, Higgs has organized more than 200 exhibitions, and his writing has appeared in more than 50 publications. His exhibition, Creative Growth, is a 50-year survey of Oakland's Creative Growth Art Center and is currently on view at the John Michael Kohler's Arts Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright is based in Brooklyn, New York, and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. Woolbright is the founder and director of the gallery Below Grand on the Lower East Side. He currently teaches at the School of Visual Arts and Pratt Institute, and we are lucky to have him as an editor-at-large here at the Rail. And with that, I'm so excited to pass it over to you, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. So excited for today. Excited to see all of you. Thanks for tuning in on your lunch breaks or in the studio to listen in on a conversation that we're thrilled to have. And thank you to the Rail team, as always, for all the behind-the-scenes work of putting together this huge slideshow and making this conversation happen. And we're going to do our best to talk about the longest-running gallery in New York, a conversation that could really extend for days and days, but we're going to try to knock it out in an hour and a half. So we're going to miss some things, but hopefully we can get an idea of the texture. Lovely to see all of you. I feel like I'm probably going to see most of you tonight at the Alvaro Barrington shows, Anton, Kurt, and Karma, which are happening. And to get started, last night as I was researching this show, I came across a wonderful definition of a plateau. A plateau is always in the middle, not at the beginning or the end. Deleuze said that. And Gregory Bateson's definition is, it is a continuous self-vibrating region of intensities whose development avoids any orientation toward a culmination point or external end. The plateau that is the Brooklyn Rail is excited to talk to the plateau that is White Columns, which has offered the art world many, many things. It has discovered many artists and it is responsible for such a rich legacy. But beyond all of that, it keeps on going. It offers these intensities that are always in the middle. So thank you, Matthew, for joining us. And hi, how you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody at the Rail for the invitation and, like you said, all the background work to make today happen.
Absolutely. So let's not waste any more time from me talking and get right into this heavy slideshow of talking about works and the history of it. And this organization that you joined in, Matthew, you've been steering. This is a photograph from the inaugural group show at 112 Green Street with Jeffrey Liu and Gordon Matta-Clark. But you're the historian on this. Let us know what do you remember from this archive that you put together?
Well, I mean, obviously, I wasn't around in 1917. I was 5 years old and living in the north of England. But I think one of it's a useful place to start, Andrew, because the history of the organization is pretty interesting and ultimately significant. And White Columns celebrated its 50th anniversary 2 years ago, actually, during the midst of the pandemic, and we organized a 50th anniversary exhibition that looked at 5 decades of activity at 112 Green Street, which was renamed White Columns in 1980. And there's a great feature in the New York Times by Brett Sokol covering the history of the organization. It's an incredibly succinct account of the organization's history. I'm sure as many of the viewers today are familiar, 112 Green Street, began in Soho, obviously, and was founded by a group of artists. And if you go to the space today, 112 Green Street, it's a Stella McCartney store. And it's actually worth your time, I think, if you find yourself in Soho, just to step in, cross the threshold into the store, because the space is essentially the same. So you can really, get a sense or a feeling for what the actual architecture was like of 112 Green Street. And I think, one of the interesting things for me as the director of White Columns is the organization isn't static, and the organization's mission, if that's the right word, is very kind of like elastic. And depending on, who is involved, where the space was, what the kind of social, economic, and political circumstances were at any given time, the organization's character is quite distinct and idiosyncratic. And also, I think who is in a kind of leadership role in the organization, who is on the board, etc., all create these kind of different or multiple overlapping or connected histories for the organization. So I think one of the things that we hoped to do when we did the 50th anniversary exhibition was at least give a sense, to someone who might be coming to this for the first time, a sense of the organization's narrative and how that narrative unfolded across time, and who some of the people were that were involved in constructing that story. What you see on your screen is an interesting document. I think it's from 1979, and it's announcing the movement of the gallery, the move of the gallery from Soho to eventually Spring Street, directly opposite the Ear Inn, 325 Spring Street, a very beautiful building that's still there and is currently empty. But the opening line just says the 112 workshop has been forced to leave its home of 8 years because of the radical shifts in Soho real estate and prohibitive rents. I think one of the interesting things that this press release might not tell you is the reason the organization was moving, that Jeffrey Liu, who was one of the co-founders of 112 Green Street, owned the building, and he was the landlord that was raising the rent on the organization that he founded. So there are kind of all these sort of interesting kind of anecdotal aspects of the organization that were present in the 50th anniversary show. And it's really well documented on the gallery's website if you're interested. I arrived at the organization in 2005, very different New York, a very different White Columns, a very different art world. And, we can get to that later. But certainly, I think as a British person, I was the first director of White Columns that didn't really have any kind of like longstanding history or connection to Manhattan, to New York, to the downtown New York art scene, whereas all the previous directors had very much emerged from the organization itself in many respects, and from the kind of communities of artists around the organization. So when I arrived at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005, there was definitely a shift, another shift in terms of how White Columns was organized. And obviously in the subsequent years, we can talk about my program and aspects of that. The image you see right now is from 1988, and it's Katie Nolan's first solo exhibition in New York, which took place at 325 Spring Street. And within a year of this exhibition happening, Katie started to show, I think, the Conderland's American Fine Arts. And within a year after that, she was a pretty much established, significant, major, visible, prominent artist. But what's interesting, I think, about the Katie Nolan show at that time, it was organized, is there's writing at the time from White Columns sort of suggesting that, questioning, I think, the need for an organization like White Columns. This is in the mid to late 1980s. And whether an organization like White Columns was necessary, given how how buoyant and healthy the commercial art world seemed to be at that time. And this sort of questioning of the organization's rationale and the questioning of White Columns, modus operandi has been a kind of constant narrative throughout the last 30 or 40 years of the organization's history. And Bill Arning was the director at the time who organized the show with Katie Nolan.
Matthew, I'd love to hear how you feel, because White Columns has had a series of wonderful directors that have really taken a turn at the wheel for a considerable amount of time. And even though it's been running for 50 years, there's only been, what, 5 or 6 directors. And it started off, as you said, kind of chaotically with Jeffrey Liu, who's this anarchic contrarian figure that's kind of trying to demolish his own space and then run, once it starts to become organized, run the organization out of the space. It's been run by people in their 20s. Bill Arning, obviously. How is the torch passed to you, and how do you feel like your sensibility aligns with this great history? Or does it?
No, I mean, the organizations had, remarkable consistency and stability in terms of its leadership, which I would imagine is fairly unusual for a quite small, in terms of its budget, in terms of its staff, quite a small nonprofit organization, which from my experience in the UK before tend to be somewhat more precarious and unstable. So there's been a really remarkable stability in the organization of White Columns over its history. There's also, and I think it's quite important, there's a kind of continuum that lasts almost 20 odd years, perhaps more, from when Josh Baer became the director in 1979. And Josh was, in charge when the organization changed its name to White Columns, when it moved to 325 Spring Street, to someone like Tom Solomon working at the organization with Josh, and then with Bill Arning working with Tom, and then with Paul Ha working with Bill Arning. And this sort of handing over of the directorship is really much conversation amongst friends and peers. And it's really only when I arrived at the end of 2004, the beginning of this century, there's a break in this kind of very fluid social narrative in terms of the leadership of the organization. So pretty much everybody prior to me knew each other, each subsequent director. In many cases, they'd worked together at the organization. And there was a kind of sort of continuum, I guess, in terms of how the organization was understood, what the mission of the organization, how people might have perceived the organization. So I felt when I arrived in 2004, 2005, there was an opportunity to rethink what White Columns is, or what White Columns might be. I'd always been very interested in the White Columns historically is considered to be the first alternative art space, or one of the first alternative art spaces in New York City. And I'd always been interested in this designation alternative, and also when it fell out of common use. And I think that's probably in the early 1990s that the term alternative art space pretty much stops being used. But it always seemed to me as a kind of very interesting identifier, in the sense that, if one's identified or as an alternative art space, then what are you an alternative to? And I think perhaps in that historical formation in the 70s and 80s, certainly in the 1970s, I think, the idea was that it was an alternative to the then, quite small commercial art market in New York, or relatively small commercial art market in New York, and also to the larger institutional narratives at that time. So organizations like White Columns, and then Artist Space, Kitchen, later in the decade, PS1, and so on, presented an alternative to those other things. But by the early 2000s, or the beginning of this century, it's less clear, I think, what an organization like White Columns might present an alternative to, or in fact, how it might behave differently. So I think, that was one of the things that we started to think about, myself, White Columns staff, and the board, when I joined the organization in 2004. And when I was looking at something else this week, I found a review by Roberta Smith of one of the first exhibitions I organized at White Columns, which was in 2005. And it was a solo show by an artist called Ori Ramirez, who's a Filipino-American artist who works at Creative Growth in Oakland. And in her review in the New York Times, Roberta Smith says that the new director of White Columns, is making changes, small and large. And the main change that she identifies is that I immediately stopped doing these sprawling group shows that the organization had become known for throughout the 1990s, where, every other 6-8 weeks, there'd be another large sprawling thematic group show. And that was one of the sort of adjustments I made coming in. But also, I think, to start supporting the work of an artist like Ori Ramirez, the organization that she works with, Oakland's Creative Growth Arts Center, which was founded also in the early 1970s and is a progressive studio that supports artists with disabilities. We start to introduce the work, supporting the work of artists with disabilities into the program. So really, I think when I joined the organization, it was really, how can we behave differently? And how can White Columns programs add to what is already available in New York? And of course, one of the amazing things about living and working or visiting New York, if you're interested in art, is there's too much to see. There's just literally too many galleries, too many shows, too many museums, too many artists, and it's kind of overwhelming, but also amazing. So I think it presents an interesting problem for any kind of gallery or organization, is like, how do you add to that in a productive and meaningful way? So a lot of the questions we've been asking over the last 17 years that I've been involved is, how can we keep adding to the conversations, the narratives, existing conversations and narratives in New York in a productive and meaningful way that allows White Columns to have a kind of idiosyncratic identity, that it can also allow us to expand, hopefully, the range of voices that we can support and present. So those are questions that we started asking ourselves 15 plus years ago, and they're hopefully questions that we continue to ask ourselves now.
It's from an outside perspective, it seems like contamination has always kind of been like productive contamination's always kind of been a through line. Going back to Jeffrey, it's like approaching artists and being like, what can't we do in most galleries? And then it's very early, it's probably, I think I'm correct, that White Columns is responsible for introducing graffiti into the gallery, at least in New York, with Fab Five Freddy. But it seems like every director is taking it as their mission to say, like, what currently isn't allowed or what currently isn't thought of here, and how can I change that context or change that conversation?
Well, I think one of the sort of key consistent tensions, perhaps, for organizations like White Columns is working in New York City is the proximity to the commercial art market, and this sort of parallel relationship that nonprofit organizations have with for-profit galleries is always a kind of sort of a threshold or a tension that I think, if you look in the 1980s and then again later in the 1990s, and even after it, before I got there in the very early part of this century, the directors of White Columns are constantly questioning the gallery's role, to use a kind of sort of baseball metaphor, as a kind of sort of feeder team for the commercial art market, and the relationship between the organization as discovering, younger artists, new voices, and then this sort of relationship with how those conversations then translate to the commercial art market. And this is pretty consistent through the 1980s and 1990s, and I think it's a part of a sort of wider perception or of people's understanding of what White Columns does. And I think one of the things that people think White Columns does is that it supports the work of younger emerging artists, and that if that they might go on to greater visibility or wider success. And I think that there was almost, when you read the text from the directors at that time, it feels like it's a kind of dilemma for them. It's like almost like, is this what we should be doing? And I think one of the things that we continue to think about in relation to those ideas is I'd say that if somebody asked me what's White Columns interested in, my answer probably would be something along the lines of, we're interested in artists' ideas before any kind of consensus forms around them. And I think that that's a pretty consistent or succinct way of thinking about what the gallery might does. I think in the 80s and 90s, the emphasis might have been on younger artists, where there's very little exhibition history, there's really no critical history. But I think what we've been interested in doing during the time I've been there is sort of expanding that to be much broader, in the sense that we're interested in the work of emerging artists, younger artists, but we're equally interested in the work of older artists, or we're also interested in the work of artists with unconventional histories. We're interested in the work of artists with no formal training. And what we want to do, hopefully, is try to represent something. We're just one organization with a staff of 5. We want to try and represent something of the complexity of visual culture. We're very interested in how art gets made. We're very interested in why art gets made. And we're very interested in who art gets made by. And hopefully, through our programs cumulatively, we can give a sense of why that might be interesting, or why that remains interesting, and why it's compelling. And I think that our real hope is that if you visit White Columns in person, or you can online, however you engage with our programs, is that each time you visit, you encounter something that's substantially different. It seems important to me that the gallery's programs shouldn't be one person's vision for what constitutes interesting art at any given point in time. It seems to me that the organization's job, in a way, or one of the things that we can do well, is to represent something of the complexity of how and why and where art gets made. And
well, that pre-consensus role is so incredibly important, because it's really a permission structure. It's like, it's looking back on that show with like Sarah Z, or even thinking about that John Kern show we showed a few slides back. If we go back to it, the Rail's own Barry Schwabsky has written about how transgressive those John Kern paintings were when they were first shown, that figuration was supposed to be dead, especially this level of kitschiness was supposed to be past. And then throughout White Columns, going through the archives, it seems like there's this suspicion of discrete objects, or like delineations. Like, there's oftentimes, Sarah Z is such a great representative of like the spill that White Columns is like allowing artists to take. And I guess what I'm saying is that other galleries are able to say, White Columns let this artist do this in their space, so I'm sure I can let them do it in mine. Which seems so important for ambitious work like this, that really challenges, like, is this sellable? Is this something that can relate to a market? You're really giving like a vote of confidence, or it's a history of giving that confidence.
Yeah, if we can go back to the John Kern one, there's an interesting slide, I think, that was in the slideshow, which is actually the checklist for John's exhibition in 1989. It's
7, yeah.
It's also interesting, I think, from a contextual and a historical point, that John's White Room exhibition in 1989 took place at the same time as Ora Rosenberg's White Room. They happened simultaneously. So it seems to me that must have been like if you're in New York at that time, that would have been an incredible thing to encounter at the same time, because Ora's pornographic rock works from that period, probably appeared equally strange as Kern's paintings might have in 89. I think one of the Bill Arning again was responsible, I think, for inviting both of these artists to show at White Columns in December 1989 through to January 1990. And when we talked the other day, Andrew, ahead of this, what's interesting is I think that John Kern's first solo show in 89, especially those high school book paintings, and the checklist that you can see on the screen now shows that the works were priced at $2,000 each, and all 5 of them sold. 2 are identified as private collection, but all of the works sold from that exhibition. But it would be another 3 years before John's next solo exhibition, which was at Andrea Rosen Gallery, which I think is the era that most people start to become more familiar with John's work. So John's exhibition was taking place in this pre-consensus moment where he had no exhibition history. The work hadn't been seen. There was really no context for someone making this kind of paintings at that point in time. 1989 is the year the kind of commercial art market imploded, certainly in New York. And another generation probably saw some openings or some opportunities coming out of that, of which John will be one of the first. And then Andrea's generation will be among the first dealers to start to establish themselves in the 1990s. coming out of that kind of schism that took place at the end of the 1980s. So I think that one of the things I think that's interesting about looking at white columns history is very much looking at when something happened and then thinking about what else was happening at the same time elsewhere in New York City and beyond. So I think later in this slideshow, there's some images of Glenn Ligon's exhibition at White Columns, which I think was a year later. I can't remember the date, but if we could go to those Glenn Ligon images, that would be great. Because I think what this sort of threshold at the end of the 80s and the very beginning of the 90s represents, I think, white columns very interesting. They have a very clear understanding, perhaps in an organic way at the time, of shifts that were taking place, not just in the New York art world, but in the art world more generally. And you see a lot of artists around this time, 89, 90, 91, start to have their first significant public exposure through organizations like White Columns. Around this time, Fred Wilson has a first show with White Columns. Glenn Ligon, obviously here, someone like Lutz Becker. Just before this, as we saw, Katie Nolan, then John Corrin, and so on. So you get a sense that, at different times in the organization's history, it's very much tapped into what comes later. But I think what's interesting is that there's a delay, or there was at this time. There was a 1, 2, 3, 4 year delay before this stuff starts to find a greater audience, before consensus starts to form, before it starts to receive more critical and curatorial attention. And that gap has narrowed, I think, considerably now. So we're very used to, I think, an artist, emerging or appearing seemingly out of nowhere. And then within 6 months, the work is very widely seen and shared. Obviously, social media plays a huge role in that. But also, I just think the dynamics of the contemporary art world have accelerated to such a degree. So I think a lot of these exhibitions were taking place in a very kind of interesting moment, historical moment, where a different generation of artists in their mid-20s to late 20s were starting to, think about new things, to make work with new materials, and a generation of dealers came up alongside them to start to kind of frame and contextualize the work. And White Columns at that time clearly had an important role in those conversations.
It seems like that, maybe it's not the right word, but almost like the gamesmanship is a consistency through all of the directors of White Columns, of having no interest in working with someone, for the most part, that is already a known entity, or less of an interest than being able to discover someone and find someone that hasn't been represented the way they should be in the art world. But I'd like to, let's jump, we're already on it. I'd love to jump in now to your first show at White Columns, building off this tradition, because I think this show really encapsulates your own ideology as a curator, but also continues that tradition. So can you talk to us about the idea for trade?
Sure, yeah. This was the first exhibition I organized as the director of chief curator at White Columns in 2005. And, I have to say, it remains one of my better ideas. That I really wish somebody else would make another version of this exhibition, because I think the subject really merits greater scrutiny and more art historical attention than my quite modest project did in 2005. But when I started to think about what would my first exhibition at White Columns be, it was really starting to think about the organization, how the organization was understood, how the organization sees itself, which is equally important. And what are some of the kind of legacies of artist-led, artist-run, artist-centered activity, which is what I'd come out of in London in the early 1990s. And one of the things that always interested me most was that despite all the kind of noise around the art economy, which, in 2005 was nothing like it is compared to today, you'd think that the art market is the only narrative at play in the art world. But I'd always been interested in the idea that probably the largest economy in the art world is the economy of artists swapping or exchanging or trading artworks. So every time I visited an artist in their house or in their studio, they'd have a work by another artist. And almost 99% of those cases, they'd swapped that work with another artist. So I was very interested in this kind of essentially invisible economy created by, for, and amongst artists that was incredibly prevalent, and where two parties agree that these different objects have equal value within the exchange. So I was very interested in this idea of a kind of sort of exchange economy, a gift economy created amongst artists. And, you know, my dream would be that one day, you know, a museum like the Museum of Modern Art or the Met might do a historical exhibition that look at now art historical works that have been traded by artists in the past. But this was really just a way to I guess sort of recenter White Columns as a artist-centered organization and an initiative here that was created for and amongst artists. So what I did was I invited 15 artists, quite different generations and different kind of backgrounds, and invited each of them to introduce me to an artist that they traded a work with in the past. And then the exhibition simply united the traded artworks. So the exhibition was installed as 15 pairs of artworks that at some point in the recent past had been swapped by artists. And we published the first issue of White Column zine. We have a zine called the WC. And the first issue of the WC simply included anecdotal accounts from the artists about the circumstances of these exchange. So the exhibition was, you know, wasn't an objective art historical account of this idea. It was very kind of biographical, personal, but what he wanted it to do is to allude to something much larger, which is this extraordinary economy where no money is involved, and this idea of exchange, of friendship, of the way that an object can represent a friendship or a connection. And it was a way sort of just to sort of reanimate White Columns, and at the same time, I think, you know, introduce myself and aspects of my sensibilities into the mix. And, you know, one of the great things I like about exhibitions is that, you know, they're temporal, you know, they're durational. And I think that the durational nature of exhibitions hasn't really been given that much consideration because, you know, they last 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, and then they're gone. And I really like this sort of temporal nature of exhibitions. And I think one of the interesting things I find about working in a nonprofit context like White Columns, and I think this must have applied to my fellow directors too, is that you really only get to work with an artist once. It's not like running a commercial galleries program where over 20 years you might work on a dozen exhibitions together with an artist. And organizations like White Columns, you tend to work with somebody once and then both parties move on. And for me, that kind of constant shift, constant rhythm, constant change, lack of certainty and continuity are also a very important part of the organization's history, but also a very important part of how we continue to work with artists. That the time we spend with an artist can be quite intense, but after the exhibition's over, that relationship tends to dissipate and diffuse and become a different kind of relationship.
Well, I love this show too. I mean, I think many curators think of, you know, like, let's say like a show on the scale of like the Great American Novel, and this show is like much more like a show on the frequency of the oral tradition. Like you said, it's like it's artists telling artists what the history is. It's not the permanence; it's like the presentness that you're oftentimes talking about as a curator. But the other thing, while we're on that topic, how are you developing relationships with artists and finding who to work with? Obviously, creative growth and visionaries and voices have been communities. You've been working since the very beginning with artists with disabilities, but Ori Ramirez and William Scott and a few others you've worked with multiple times. How have you developed those relationships that have lasted so
long? Well, I think, you know, what, certainly from my, you know, personal relationship with working with artists, you know, I went to art school and trained as an artist. So, you know, I like to think that I come to the role of curator, or even the role of a director, as a kind of artist curator, or even an artist director, you know, an artist administrator, if such a hyphenate is possible. And I always saw or understand my interest in art, my relationship with artists, as ongoing and accumulative. And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in with other curators' work, for example, is the accumulative nature of what they do. So a curator like Lynn Cook, who I have the most admiration for, I'm really interested in the body of work and how it evolves and accumulates over time. So certainly for my relationship with working with artists, it's for me, they're often very specific to specific and identifiable moments in time, that when I first encounter an artist's work, whatever the circumstances are, or if I'm introduced to an artist's work, whatever the circumstances are, that precise moment in time historically becomes very important to my relationship with either working with that artist shortly after or coming back to that work later. And this sort of how these things relate to one's own story, one's own biography, are incredibly important. And I think that in terms of, I don't know if the question meant more broadly about, you know, where does one encounter work, and then how does one make a decision to work with artists? I think for me, it was certainly in my role at White Columns, which is very different to my role outside of White Columns when I may guest curate something for someone else. At White Columns, where, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're always very consciously thinking about artists whose work doesn't yet have a kind of, there isn't a clear narrative yet around their work. I'm very interested in thinking about work where there isn't a published history, there isn't a critical or curatorial account. So that as an individual, you have to develop a kind of, you have to make your own, develop your own relationship with the work and then the artist, and start to develop some of the terms you might have, which is very different than, say, working with an established artist, where a lot of those terms are already identifiable. So for me, a lot of the interesting process is starting to develop an understanding of an individual's artist's work for myself, based on whatever evidence is available to me. And sometimes that's simply an encounter with the work in another context. The work might speak to me for one reason or another, and it might intrigue me to pursue a different kind of conversation with the artist. Or it might be a case of, seeing a historical body of work that I was unfamiliar with and feeling that, I would like to test this in public, and in order to start, in a way, to initiate more consensus around that body of work. So it's always different. And, I think there's working with, say, a recent graduate from an MFA program is very different from working with an artist at a center like Creative Growth or Visionaries and Voices, where more often we collaborate with the organization itself, although not exclusively. And it's very different than working with an estate of an artist that's no longer with us. So each different encounter with an artist's work presents its own interesting issues and concerns, and it necessitates almost a different kind of response.
Well, I mean, part of the reason I ask too is talking to people who have worked with you and doing my own research too, everyone has mentioned, or many people have mentioned, how much trust and faith you put in the artist, that once it comes time for install, you're hands off and you're saying, if you want to come talk to me, you can come talk to me, but, just be responsible with the space. And I'm wondering about how I think it's wonderful as a curator that you really buy into the artists themselves and trust their ideas. And I'm wondering about situations in the past, like that moment, I can trust this person with the space, or they'll make something really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hope, when we make an invitation to an artist to show at White Columns, we hope, that it's an interesting idea for them. And we hope that they're interested in having their work within this sort of ongoing historical line of White Columns itself. But we also hope that it's an opportunity for them to present their work without some of the external pressures and forces an artist might encounter, say, with a first exhibition in a commercial gallery show, where there is some kind of external forces around whether it's a success or not, whether things sell and so forth. These kind of questions aren't necessarily that relevant or significant at White Columns. So we hope it's an opportunity for an artist to represent themselves and their ideas on their own terms in a productive way, because I think making presenting one's ideas in public is always kind of nerve-wracking, somewhat trepidatious, and full of lots of unknowns. So I think that hopefully the part that White Comms can look after is the organization, and the organization's context. We can create hopefully visibility. White Comms is a very interesting, focused audience, I think, and hopefully some of our audience is in a position to take what they see at White Comms or what they encounter at White Comms and then extend the conversation for those ideas elsewhere. So we want it to be a good experience, and you'd think, oh, well, but, I think we all know from anecdotal accounts that for artists presenting work in any circumstances, it's not always a good experience. And we really want it to be a great experience for artists, more than anything. And, whether the shows, how we would measure the success of a show is, I think that often happens much later. I've said it before, but I think it takes about 5 to 10 years for an artist's ideas to settle and, to find a kind of coherent form that, a broader public might understand. It takes as long as that. And I think it's one of the great things about art is just how slow it is. So what's happening in the present tense is obviously very important from a visceral engagement perspective. But I think the subsequent legacy of that work is much more nuanced and slow. And I think that's something that we've always been interested in, and we're increasingly thoughtful about, is what's the subsequent legacy of the work we do at White Comms, and how does that then, what happened in, say, 2010, how does that feel in 2022, and so on. So it's those kind of sort of shifting, the kind of social history of the work we do is as important, I think, as its present, visceral and more present tenseness.
Absolutely. I mean, I really enjoyed too, a few slides back showing your 10-year White Columns curation, and it's a similar sensibility to Fong's curation at the Rail of really believing in non-hierarchy. Like there's a work by Kevin Beasley that's very early, and then there's work from the Healing Arts Initiative. There are artists like early in their career and late in their career. You're borrowing work from Mikkel Boschin, but also artists that are like giving the work to you directly and aren't working with the gallery. And it all obviously goes well together at the end of it, but you're approaching work in this, it's beyond the CV. It's about like what speaks to now and has this presentness to it.
Well, the next exhibition of White Columns opens next Friday on the 21st of January, and it's the 13th edition of the White Columns Annual, and it's as its title suggests, it's an annual exhibition, although we had a 3-year break during the pandemic and when we had to relocate the gallery. But the idea for the annual really emerged when I arrived at White Columns, and I felt at that time that a lot of the biennials and the triennials that were proliferating at that time, there was a kind of a tendency towards the idea that these exhibitions should be almost, or might be, objective, if such a thing was possible. And what I was interested in thinking about was what role our subjectivity plays in our relationship with art, but also within our day-to-day encounters with art. Like, where do we go to see art as individuals? What routes do we take as individuals? What connections do we make as individuals? So the idea of the annual exhibition each year, this year it's been organized by an independent curator in New York called Olivia Shao, is to ask someone a year ago to spend the year they're looking at art in New York City, and just to make notes and to keep a record of things they saw, things they encountered, often in very different circumstances. It might be an artist studio, it might be a not-for-profit space, may even be in a museum. And then towards the end of the year to make an exhibition based on that experience. So now 13 different people have done the annuals. And for me, it was just about this idea, this sort of almost like encouraging subjectivity, which is often, I think, certainly within larger institutional structures, often suppressed. And also thinking about, the kind of emphasis of larger biennials, which do seem to aspire to a kind of zeitgeist-like narrative, whereas the White Columns Annual is something that's much more kind of personal, much more intimate, and much more social, I think. So I've always been interested in the kind of social connections of artists, but also in social connections of viewership in terms of how and why and where we go. So this was my exhibition in 2016, so 6 years ago. I mean, this was some of the things that I saw that year in different circumstances that resonated with me. And like you said, I think it reflects some of the ongoing interests I have in the work of artists with disabilities, in the work of centers that support artists with disabilities, the work of artists with no formal training, but then also artists with much more conventional schooling. And what happens when you put all that together in a space? My hope is that new kind of connections might emerge temporarily. But also, I think what's more important to me is that when you go out to see shows, I might go to, say, Tribeca and see 20 or 30 shows in a day. What does that mean? What's the legacy of that inside you as a person? What do you take from that? What do you reconstruct later in your memory? And then what from that experience becomes useful in subsequent work? And that ongoing aspect of looking at art is very much what the annual exhibition is about. And I think that Olivia's exhibition, which opens on Friday, will be as different as Mary Manning's exhibition, which opened last year, and so on. And it's nice to see these images of this show, though, because I hadn't forgotten about it, but it's not in the front of my mind. And a lot of the things, like this room, you can see here as works in the background by Christopher Knowles, and on the right, works by Alice Mackler, just for example. And that's the kind of conversation I like again, that reminds me of why I was thinking about that at that time. It's also nice to see the old space again, which was on just 3 blocks further up on Horatio Street, which is still empty. White Columns' 3 previous spaces, 325 Spring Street, Christopher Street, and the space you can see now are all still empty.
Wow.
Classic real estate scam.
Yeah, I love the Mary Manning selected a work from Below Grand, and so I'm a little aware of the process. I've always thought it'd be great to write reviews in hindsight, because sometimes it takes a year to know what the best show you saw was, or realize what you're still talking about. So I love that White Columns perpetuates this. Okay, now in hindsight, what was the thing? And it's incredible. There's that like Kevin Beasley sculpture, just like hanging, like you're picking work that has such radical subjectivity to it, such affect and punch, and you're finding ways to like balance it together, which I think is really impressive.
Yeah, and I like when you put these images together to see that Kevin's work is adjacent to an amazing group of works by Virginal Davis, and just somehow that still resonates for me in a way that remains unclear.
Yeah, and I mean, both those artists are artists that I think most people would want to put in solo shows, and are a little maybe afraid to put in a group show just because of how much weight and force there is to it. And you found a way to balance both together. So I think it's really exciting. Could we talk about the Park Bench show? We had that slide up, but this show is still up right now. I'd love for you to talk about this one.
Yeah, and for the record, as we're on Zoom, this is the best idea I've ever had. This is I remember visiting New York. I can't remember when it was, a long time ago, 30 years ago, and going to Central Park and sitting on a bench and noticing that the bench was dedicated to someone, and it's stuck with me ever since. Just the idea that through the agency of the Parks Department, and I assume you can do this in other cities around the world, you can dedicate a park bench to someone that was meaningful to you. It might be a family member, it might be someone else. The connection between the dedicator and the dedicatee is often obscure, in the sense that I sat on benches and I have no idea who the person is that it's dedicated to, and I certainly don't know the people who made that gesture. But it seemed to be a really remarkable thing to do in public space, and it also seemed to be a remarkable function or facility of the city, that an administration and bureaucratic function of the Parks Department allows people to do this, that you can pick a bench, name it for someone, hand over the check, and the Parks Department look after it for at least 10 years, and you can renew it, obviously. So I became very interested in this idea of public space as a kind of sort of memorial space, and wanted to create an artist memorial garden. So I wanted to create a large-scale public artwork that was essentially invisible. And working with the Art Production Fund and the Parks Department, we invited around 40 artists to each dedicate a park bench in Jackson Square Park. It's a very small but interesting triangular park that was next to Whitcomb's previous space. It's on 8th Avenue in Greenwich, and simply just invited them to dedicate a park bench. And like my initial encounter with a park dedicated bench in Central Park all those years ago, it's not clear in most cases who dedicated the bench, why it's dedicated. And also, if you're not paying attention, you wouldn't be aware that there's 40 of them in the park. You might just be aware of the one that you're sat on. And we really sort of allowed the artists to interpret the invitation any way they wanted. So the one you can see right now on screen is, Judith Bernstein. And this was her response at that time. And if you go through, there's others that are here. But for me, what was important was that we didn't really make a big deal of this, that it's there for a decade. And if we can afford to renew the leases on the park benches, then we will. But for me, it was just important that it was sort of encountered by passers-by. And on the outside of the Parks Department put up one of their kind of classic green and white signs that identifies it as the New York Artist Memorial Garden. And it gives you a link to Whitcomb's website, where you can see the list of artists who dedicated, and then also the people that they dedicated to. And there's a little PDF of a map in the park if you want to take it with you and walk around. But that wasn't really the hope for this. The hope was really to think about monuments, to think about public monuments, and to think about the memorial, and also to think about public art. And thinking about, say, something like Richard Serra's titled Tilted Arc, and the kind of furore around these kind of monolithic works of public art. But here is to create a work of public art collectively or collaboratively amongst 40 artists. This one's Yoko Ono to John Lennon, and it's one of the very few where the dedicator put their name in it, so Yoko's identified here. But really to sort of reanimate a public space in a very subtle way, without it actually fundamentally changing. And my hope was, or my hope remains, is that people will borrow this idea and do it in their own communities. And in this park at Jackson Square, we left a number of benches undedicated because obviously we want the public to have an opportunity to continue to make dedications for themselves. And a number of benches have subsequently been dedicated. And once I think people understand that you can do this, and I think from memory, it's about $2,500 per bench, which over 10 years seems to be like an unbelievable deal. And the city produced the plaque, the city installed the plaque, and the city replaced the plaque if for any reason they're removed. So it seems to me, just this a very beautiful part of city life, and a very beautiful part of the kind of bureaucracy of living in a city. So there's about 40 of them there, and it's open obviously all day. This one's dedicated by Glenn Ligon, who obviously has a lot of the artists that we invited had a historical connection to Whitcomb's. And this is dedicated to obviously Beaufort Delany, artist, visionary, expatriate, and then he has his dates.
Very cool. It's a beautiful piece. It's also interesting to see, kind of as again an overview, not to keep doing this to you, but there does seem to be a somewhat consistent theme of the monument, and questioning the scale that's needed for a monument. Like you've worked with William Scott before. This show this year that I got to review, Dr. Charles Smith's show, there's the idea of like, how do you have a moving monument or like a scalable monument, and this show kind of gets at that as well. And this is the show you just curated at Creative Growth. And again, that's an organization you've worked with for many years now, worked with their artists. You want to talk to us about the show that's currently up at Kohler Arts Center?
Sure. For people who are tuning in and aren't familiar, the Creative Growth Arts Center in Oakland is by my reckoning, the most important cultural organization in the United States. So I'm happy to put that out there. It was founded in 1974, and it will celebrate its 50th anniversary in 2024. And I discovered Creative Growth in 2002 when I moved to the Bay Area from London. So by that time, Creative Growth had already been around for 30 years. So I came very late to the organization, but I've worked with Creative Growth pretty much consistently for the last 20 years, collaborating with both the organization and its artists. And it was founded by Elias Katz and Florence Luden Katz in 1974 in their home in Berkeley. And it was a center for individuals with disabilities, and it was to create a platform for them to explore their creativity. And the Katz, I can't paraphrase the Katz's ideas here, but the Katz's ideas are really so forward-thinking and far-sighted. And they were one of the earliest advocates for the disabilities rights movement, which ran parallel to the civil rights movement, women's rights, and so on, gay rights, which were very prevalent, obviously, in the Bay Area at that time, too. It was a very kind of conducive place for a place like Creative Growth to begin. But this exhibition at the John Michael Kohler Art Center, which is in a town called Sheboygan in Wisconsin, it's an hour north of Milwaukee. If you have a bucket list, I would add it to your bucket list, because the John Michael Kohler Art Center and its recently opened Art Preserve is one of the greatest institutions in the United States. And the Art Preserve is really one of the great museums in the world. And I was very happy that this exhibition is taking place within that framework. And it's a 5-decade survey, retrospective perhaps, of the work of Creative Growth. And it features the work of 22 artists that have worked at Creative Growth during that time or continue to work there. So in the current image you can see on the screen, the sculpture in the front is by Tony Piedemonte. And then the works behind are by Nicole Storm, who had a solo show at White Columns recently. But it's really the first attempt to create a kind of overview of Creative Growth as an organization, as a place, but it's really just focused on and privileged and centered around the work produced there. And certainly from my own reckoning of my work as a curator, when I started to work with Creative Growth in 2002, certainly my introduction to Creative Growth and my experience of Creative Growth fundamentally shifted everything I thought I knew about art. And all of the work I've done since then has been done in the light of that experience. So the work I did prior to 2002, I feel is quite different than the work I've done since I encountered Creative Growth. And certainly Creative Growth remains the kind of sort of central thought for me in terms of what art might be, how art might function, what art might be for, these sort of somewhat amorphous questions that we might ask ourselves from time to time that seem unanswerable. But I felt when I first went to Creative Growth that it was the first time I had a kind of very visceral understanding of what art might be for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a William Scott, again, recurring work, and something that I really value and appreciate in your curation, and all curation that's good curation is working through a community of finding artists through other artists, and Creative Growth has been that kind of engine for you of like starting at that place and expanding out to other aesthetics. Could we jump ahead? I included some slides, or I'm sorry, Eleanor included some slides. I asked her to put them in of Nicole Storm, Dr. Charles Smith, and some shows that you are bringing them into White Columns. And I think it's so important to show how their work is being shown, because what I like about these shows, beyond just like the incredible work, is that you're working with artists and you're helping them find solutions that are realizing the strangeness of pulling work out of the original context and putting it in a white cube gallery in New York, and you're trying to find ways to kind of create and keep the tension that's held in its first space. So what was it like working with Nicole and this incredible installation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy that we can sort of bring our part of the conversation to a close, Andrew, on some recent projects. Yeah. This is the work of Nicole Storm. Nicole's an artist affiliated with Creative Growth in Oakland. Nicole has Down syndrome, And this was her first solo exhibition outside of Creative Growth. And Nicole traveled to New York last summer and spent a week or so in our space, creating a kind of sort of very immersive, organically structured and organized installation that included works painted directly onto the wall, as you can see in the corner behind the box. And then it incorporated existing sculptural and painted and drawn works that she'd made previously. You know, for me, and I think for Creative Growth too, and I hope for Nicole, that this was a very kind of significant exhibition that may not necessarily be apparent to the visitor. It was the first time an artist from Creative Growth had traveled to create a site-specific installation. And I think this is something that clearly we hope can happen more often in the future. Again, for White Columns, it just continued our ongoing commitment, not just to Creative Growth and its artists, but to artists working in progressive art studios nationally and internationally. And the work was incredibly well received. Roberta Smith included it in her best exhibitions of last year. And for us, it's just, it's part of an ongoing, it's part of a commitment, I think. I think commitment's the right word, to the ideas that the Katz has developed in the early 1970s in the East Bay, and trying to create a greater awareness or a broader awareness for some of those ideas. And you know, Nicole's work, I think, you know, deserves to be seen by as many people as possible. And we hope, and I think we know actually, that the exhibition will lead to subsequent opportunities for her. And it was great having Nicole in the space. And it was, you know, it was great to watch an art. This is a beautiful part of the exhibition, which is in our lobby space, where she extended her exhibition outside of the, you know, the space that she was ostensibly working in, and took it into a kind of more public space, where her work was then in an encounter with the work of Norma Tanega, which was the other exhibition at the time. But this is a wall painting, and its height, Nicole's quite short, and its height is determined by her reach. And there's a very beautiful physical logic, aesthetic logic to the physicality of the work itself. And then I think the next images are of Lloyd Foster. This was in March, April, so it's less than a year ago now. And this was Lloyd's kind of his first gallery show in New York City. He was a recent graduate from NYU's photo department. And I was to, you know, go back to one of your early questions, like how does one find out about artists, or where does, you know, one counter work? My wife's an artist called Ann Collier, and she'd been invited to the photo department at NYU to do studio visits. And after a day of doing studio visits, she came back and told me about the people she'd met. And she said, I met this really interesting artist called Lloyd Foster. And myself and White Columns curatorial assistant at the time, Brittany Adeline King, we went over to see Lloyd shortly after, and the exhibition came out of that. And I thought one of the great things about, well, one of the really great things about Lloyd's work, you know, I think the work's fantastic, is that it's coming out of photography, but it doesn't really seem to advertise itself in that way. But all of the photographic imagery, which is the kind of starting point for each of these kind of sculptural or painted or drawn objects, emerges from one of Lloyd's photographs taken between the United States and Africa. And I just thought it was an incredibly, I think there's another image, which is a really great installation shot. It's a really incredible, inventive, free, and very kind of open relationship with making that allowed a photographic image to be suspended almost within these other kind of material and aesthetic thoughts. I think there's one more image of Lloyd's show. I can't remember, yeah, that one, which I really love. Yeah. So the works are kind of very animated when you're in the space. They're moving and you move through them. And I thought it created a very kind of very beautiful resonance. This thesis show at NYU's gallery in Washington Square Park was really an extraordinary thing. I think a really remarkable thesis exhibition. And then I think the final images in this slideshow by Dr. Charles Smith. And this for me is it was a conversation that this happened in the summer of last year, but it's a conversation that began 5 years earlier when I'd been invited to the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan to work on a different project. And I encountered this incredible exhibition organized by the artist Heather Hart, where she created an environment a physical architectural environment in which she staged sculptures by Dr. Charles Smith. And I'd never heard of Dr. Charles Smith's work before. And then as I learned more, and as I went to the Kohler's storage area, they have several hundred of his works, learned, a lot. And the short story is that he's a self-taught artist. He's a Vietnam veteran. And he started making work in the mid-1980s in his home in Illinois at the time. This gives you a sense of how the work is made. This is his home in Hammond, Louisiana, which he recently left. And the work was produced in a public setting. The work was made, often made outdoors, but the work was installed outside within the community. So the work was really encountered mostly by passers-by, people who live in that neighborhood, people who pass through that neighborhood. And Dr. Charles, I think, saw the work very much as having a kind of forceful public narrative around relationships to African-American history, and also to his investment and interest in the lives of Black veterans. And the Kohler acquired, I think, 400 of his sculptures, something like 400 of his sculptures from his previous site, which was in Aurora, Illinois. And I immediately, said to the people at Kohler, it'd be wonderful to do an exhibition in New York. And then that was kind of agreed on 5 years earlier. The pandemic got in the way. White Columns had to relocate to its current space. So the exhibition finally took place last summer. And one of the important things I think about the exhibition, this is essentially Dr. Charles's first exhibition in a gallery. He's in his mid-80s now, is that these were the first sculptures he'd made that were intended to be shown indoors, so to speak, that they were works that are intended to be shown in galleries. So they have a slightly different scale than the works that you might have encountered on his property. And consequently, because they're not public-facing works in the sense that you don't encounter them in public space, they have a kind of different resonance. The resonance is clearly much more to our encounters with other kinds of sculptural forms. And there was a beautiful full-page feature. If you're interested in Dr. Charles's work and his life, there's an amazing full-page feature on his work written by Randy Kennedy in the New York Times that coincided with the show. And Dr. Charles has a show currently at the Veterans Museum in Chicago, and a bigger presentation of his work than we were able to do at White Columns. But for me, this was just a great example of encountering something, in this case, in a project by an artist in Sheboygan, learning more about the work, traveling down to Louisiana to meet Dr. Charles, and then to be able to introduce the work to new audiences. And then through, the agency of someone like Randy Kennedy in the New York Times, it could find a national and international resonance. And it was really just a very beautiful organic process of how that came about.
I was really struck by the naming of each sculpture in this show. There's a wonderful magic to, again, non-hierarchy, that some of these figures are named after specific people and some aren't. But the way he's rendering them, there's this like wonderful kind of uniformity with the right amount of personality to each one that I really just thought was magical, and couldn't get enough of this show. So I'm glad you introduced it.
I also think, I think as an artist, Dr. Charles, his identity as an artist, and I think something we're very interested in at White Columns, is complicated, because I think, as recently as 5 years ago, the work might have been categorized as outsider art, folk art, vernacular art, or any, those other kind of terms that seem to, try to kind of sort of marginalize the artist's identity, and then subsequently the achievement of the work. And I think that his identity as a self-taught artist problematizes all of those things. And the work itself obviously problematizes not just that, but other kinds of issues that he's thinking about in the work itself. And, that interest we have, or ongoing interest we have in artists with unconventional histories, is that exemplified perhaps, by the last three shows we've looked at, whether that's Nicole Storm, Lloyd Foster, or Dr. Charles, that their arriving at art couldn't be more different. How they got to making art couldn't be more different. And ultimately that difference is the thing that we're really interested in privileging. So I hope some of that makes sense. If anyone's interested, White Columns archive is really pretty comprehensive. It's on the website. and it goes back to 1970. And you can get it, I think, if even if you just dip into it, you can get a pretty interesting sense of the organization at any given point in time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thanks for continually being a part of the discovery of artists that are engaged in a radical subjectivity and a curiosity that is an impulse that will never stop for them, in seeing it non-hierarchically, not worrying about where their background brings them to this moment, but just being a part of that discovery. Thank you to White Columns, and apologies to everyone that this is such a superficial way of going through White Columns. I wish we had more time, but would love to hand the mic over to people in the audience that have questions. So thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Matthew. This has been so incredible and inspiring. We have a bunch of questions from the audience. So our first question is from Buzz, and I'll ask on Buzz's behalf. Buzz wrote, I appreciate the expression of support for artists about whom a consensus has not arisen, but who does Matthew consider to be a member of that consensus?
Well, I know Buzz, so hi, Buzz. Thanks for the question. I often think that if someone said, well, what's the art world about? Obviously it's a very general and somewhat vague question. It's really about the creation of consensus, and how does that happen? And I often thought that a great class to teach, either as an art history class or an MFA program, anywhere in fact, would be to look at one artist's CV, say an artist that's been showing for 30 years, and just do almost like scientific analysis of how that artist's work moved through time and to increasingly larger or higher profile platforms and so on. Because it can be very scientifically mapped. It's not accidental. So how an artist's work moves through the culture, it can be understood, and it's documented and can be read. And I think a lot of those things are about the creation of consensus, which is ultimately the creation of agreement. And I think to go back to what we're interested at White Columns is what does it mean to show work where that doesn't yet exist? On the one hand, you could say, well, the work has, there's a kind of openness to the work to be subject to external forces and opinions and interpretations. Some of those ideas might stick to the work. But also, I think there's a kind of freedom that the work has, very briefly perhaps, where it's not tethered to an existing narrative. And of course, as the work moves through a culture, cultures, it becomes more increasingly tethered to a wide, the consensus, a broader understanding, agreement around what it might mean. And I think one of the most interesting things about the art world of the 21st century, I'm a very big fan of the working in the present tense. I think now is the best time to be an artist. Now is the best time to be a curator. Now is the best time to be looking at art. But one of the more interesting things I think that's happened in this century, let's say, is that the kind of rigid nature of consensus that existed in the 70s and 80s, for example, is being revealed for it being very narrow, and a lot of things were excluded for all kinds of reasons from the larger conversation. And we're having a quite a rare but sustained opportunity to reconsider all kinds of art that somehow didn't fit or make sense with whatever the the forces of consensus were at any given time. So I think consensus is really, to answer Buzz's question, is kind of all of us. We're all implicated in this sort of unspoken, perhaps, or subconscious process of agreement, where we collectively decide that something merits further exposure and further attention. But I was saying to Andrew the other day when we were talking about this conversation, is that if you look at White Columns archive in its in its totality or in its depth, there are hundreds of artists who showed at White Columns who are now much better known, but there are actually thousands of artists who showed at White Columns that remain underknown. And that group of artists is equally important to the story of White Columns, to the story of the kitchen, to the story of artist space, and so on, as the artists who, where consensus landed. And, I think for me, one of the interesting things is that, there are whole areas of cultural production where zero consensus still exists. So the work of artists associated with places like creative growth, there's still no consensus whatsoever about what that is, what even the work is, let alone whether it's important or not. And consequently, I think, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of room, I think, for organizations, big, small, and otherwise, just to start behaving differently. Because I think at some point, we can't rely on the commercial art market as being the defining form of consensus. Yet, until very recently, everything we saw in the museum had been filtered through the commercial art market. I have nothing against the commercial art market. I love galleries. They're some of the most focused, visionary, and subjective places you'll ever have to encounter art. But for a long time, larger institutions used that as a measure of the value of something. So almost 99% of the things you'd see in a museum pass through the hands of a commercial or through the commercial art world. I don't think that needs to be the case. I think there's space for artists who've arrived at art or artworks that have come to our attention through other means to have a kind of public forum too. Obviously, we believe in everything we show at White Columns, but we don't expect everyone else to.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matthew. And thanks, Buzz, for that great question. Our next question is from our friend GE. Should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, Andrew, and Matthew. But when I first went to speed trials at White Columns in 1983, seeing and being in the music of the time, the Fall, Sonic Youth, BC Boys, and more, Mofongo, all of it, I knew I was witnessing something more than just a gallery, and that I was witnessing a kind of event, and maybe an event that just went through time. Has White Columns become such a life form because it's more of an event than a gallery?
Well, thanks for that question. And, to the viewers who might not be familiar with speed trials, I actually made one of the earliest shows I made at White Columns, I think 2005, 2006, was a reflection on speed trials and an earlier music program at White Columns called Noise Fest. We're really, at that time, with Josh Baer and the gallery when it was on 325 Spring, was very connected to whatever was unfolding within the kind of musical subcultures of Lower Manhattan. So there was a very kind of intimate relationship between those two kind of milieus at that time. And I think that sort of ongoing history of art's relationship with music culture is obviously, rich. We see an organization like Blank Forms in Brooklyn really exploring this in really remarkable ways. But I think that, the reason I wanted to revisit speed trials perhaps taps into something of your experience of that event and how it animated the organization in a very kind of social way and brought in a public to the gallery that might not typically visit a space like White Columns. But it also spoke very clearly to me and my experience as a teenager in England of becoming interested in art. And I became interested in art through music, like a lot of people. So my route to visual culture came through musical culture. And what I thought was interesting to think about is that's part of White Columns' DNA. I don't think it should be a primary concern. Obviously, with an organization like the Kitchen, the performative is clearly much more central. And, they have amazing histories within that. But I liked the fact that it was part of the rhythm of White Columns at that time. And I also really liked that it was part of the transition from 112 Green Street and this kind of sort of late 60s, perhaps, ideology into something that more closely resembles what happened in the world, culturally, socially, and politically in the late 70s and early 80s, I guess, coming out of punk or something like punk. And that sort of reanimates White Columns in quite an interesting way at that time. And, Josh Baer was the director at the time. I think he was in his very early 20s when he was hired. And then Tom Solomon was working alongside him. So you see this very interesting intersection of art, music, design, and other things around that time. And, that's something that we want to keep within our program. So we have a record label at White Columns. It's called The Sound of White Columns, where we release recordings by artists who are musicians or musicians who are also artists. And that's something that we remain committed to.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, GE. Our next question will be from Lynn Crawford.
Thank you. This was wonderful. And I have a question about place. You mentioned traveling outside of New York and encountering artists and then bringing them back into New York. And I'm curious how often you pick up shop and go guest curate. And I'm asking because you did this in Detroit, probably one of our first shows at Museum of Contemporary Art you did, Words Fail Me. And your presence there and the artists that you chose made such a difference on the community and really raised the bar for the future of our museum. And so I'm just curious, about your thoughts about that kind of a flow. Coming to New York coming to Detroit or wherever, or Sheboygan or wherever. And also just to belatedly thank you for helping MoCAD start off on the right foot.
Well, thanks for that. And again, if visitors aren't familiar with MoCAD's history, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, I was invited to make one of the earliest shows there. I think a second or third exhibition.
Klaus Curtis did the first one.
Yeah. And then, in their incredibly beautiful space in downtown Detroit. And then, MoCAD was an organization that was forming, an institution that was forming, which I liked a great deal because there was no history for me to wrestle with in sense of institutional history. It felt like an open invitation. And I made an exhibition called Words Fail Me that looked at the relationship between uncertainty and language, and how language is, one's psychological, emotional, personal, political, social, and so forth. And for me, it was great to make an exhibition in a community that I wasn't that familiar with, to make an exhibition in a city that was in transition. And I guess, you probably argue Detroit remains in transition, but certainly for an institution that was starting to think about itself, public facing and so forth. And we were able to include Martin Creed's neon work on the front of the building that says everything is going to be all right, which at that time, nearly 20 years ago, perhaps wasn't so clear or sure or certain. And I think the MoCAD recently reinstated the work on the front of that building, which is fantastic. So in terms of your question, though, I mean, most of my time is at White Columns, but, I like to do projects outside of White Columns. I just don't have a great deal of time to do them now. But when I do have an opportunity, I like it to be something that's quite specific and interesting, and often in an idiosyncratic setting or circumstances, like MoCAD at the beginning, or more recently in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And each of those opportunities or invitations presents its own, interesting problems, and how to make an exhibition in a community that you're not familiar with, how to make an exhibition in an organization or an institution that has an established history like the Kohler, or to make one in an exhibition where you're hopefully part of that forming history. And very recently, the last show we had at White Columns that closed just before Christmas was an incredible exhibition of Kay Barnmiller's work, the Detroit artist.
Exactly. Yeah.
We organized in collaboration with the Detroit Gallery Watt Pipeline, and Barnmiller's an artist whose work I wasn't familiar with, and with Erin Somerville, White Columns deputy director, and we organized this kind of survey of a key Detroit artist from that period through the 70s into the 90s before she passed. Mm-hmm. And to me, the work was a real revelation. And again, there's no consensus really outside of Detroit. Maybe there's no consensus in Detroit about Kay Barnmiller's work, but I think it's 5-10 years time, we'll all be seeing museum shows of her work as a broader understanding of her achievement becomes clearer. But I love my time in Detroit, and I love visiting again whenever I get a chance. And it's been interesting to see the trials and tribulations of MoCAD. which are ongoing, and it's a great place. It's certainly one of the best physical spaces for art in this country. And at the opening of Words Fail Me, we had the amazing opportunity to bring John Giorno to Detroit.
That was
Created this amazing spoken word performance that, I will never forget.
epic. Yeah, you made a difference.
Oh,
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was our closing question for the Q&A today. And thanks again, Matthew, for those great answers. And now, as is Rail tradition, we will be ending our community event, our NSE, with a poetry reading. And I'm thrilled today to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Terrence Arjoon, to the stage. Terrence is a poet and bookmaker whose work has appeared in Tagwork, the Poetry Project newsletter, and Green Slate. He edits 1080 Magazine and the Brooklyn Review and co-organizes the poetry series at Pete's Candy Store. Thank you so much for being here, Terrence.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll jump right in. Thank you, Eleanor and Chloe. Thanks, Matthew and Andrew, for your talk. That was amazing. This is a poem in 7 parts, a contrapuncti outside the palazzo. 1. I steal everything. I'm plashing. I'm plashing on those leaves. Infuse wild stallions wet like leaves with the break of a prickly day. The day is this, a custard. The day is something that is spread. I'm spreading on the leaves. Spreading out from a yellow bud in hollow reverie, the custard. It is the yellow bud from which the day comes. The stolen custard flashes demons who resent the prickly day, who stole stallions in the west, who sit stealing the small rain kept in cups of diaphanous blue. 2. I put my soul on the counter, it coats the counter in a hazy way, carping through Brill Lake Remedy at a spray of letters, winding us up in a bent way, figuring space across the encrusted custard spray. The mandala of states is strewn with tables. Pull the bell, my love, the panthers roar. Oh, spooky infarction at a distance. No letters today, only more leaves fallen. 3. I shove into the hollow bones of real estate. I infarct into fast casuals. I want you inside real estate. I want you to be amazed at me inside real estates. You love to be amazed at you. I am amazed at diverse depths. I shove into brass alembics at Quiznos. I spread all over Quiznos. I retort in copper alembics. I distill rose water and spread it and plash it on those leaves. 4. You is a hollow bone. You is a blue door. You sit stealing small rain. You were Sophia, now 8 Bog Marie. 8 Bog Marie sings fitfully. The logs crackle. You act with difficulty. Your actions are metaphorical. Your acts are an unrelated difficulty. You act as sassafras' 3 leaves plashed upon. Coffee grains to the late boundaries, you break every rock in the exterior. 5. I sing fitfully. I spread at the baseball field. I pull the trigger on garden watchy and dreadful lofts. I'm watching my 3 bones. I kindle this blue wood. Blue wood is unceasing coincidence. I coincidentally saw a panther once. I'm panther watching on the fire escape. I am laying next to 3 panthers. Weathers must be all, even infarcted upon. I separate the sassafras and then adelphus. 6. The wind makes no decisions. It is west. It is a custom of space, so coincidence. The wind was a tremendous horn. I'm in 8 Bog Marie's palazzo. In the winter, the bogs are covered. I am wet of your water, so we sit until midnight. We make 3 bows and ask for lights in our hands. The rain has been stolen away. The mountain had been shoved lake-wise in a custard slant. 7. I crumble in my bolero pocket. I'm off in a burnt-out Camaro speeding over ripe pips past fast casuals. Lizards, the kind you know best, were plashing in good weather. They were escaping the missed book fair. They were escaping the missed art fair. There was a blue door to the sea saying something in a paratactic gleam 10 minutes away from the palazzo. Thank you.
That was incredible. Thank you so, so much, Terrence. And thank you so much again to Andrew and Matthew for such an illuminating conversation.
Yeah.
We would also,
Thanks to everybody that registered and signed up to listen to. Appreciate it.
yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And we'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, as well as for their support of our growing archive, which you can check out on the Rails YouTube channel. And for the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics in our monthly publication and public events. Please check the chat for a link to donate and support the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow, join us at 1 p.m. for conversation with Leiko Ikemura and Barbara Pollock on the event of Leiko's show Anima Alma at Fergus McCaffrey. We conclude with a poetry reading by Cindy Ju Young Oak. Thank you again, Andrew. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Terrence. Thanks to you all for being here. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye, everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thanks, everybody.
Great poetry, Terrence.
Yeah, wonderful
Thank you.
poetry. I'm sure I'll see a lot of you out tonight.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye, everybody.